event to ICOMOS Scientific Symposium 2021, which will be held on 19th and 20th of November 2021 on the theme architecture, on the theme cultural landscapes and transformation and emerging ideas. This is an event by ICOMOS Central Zone in collaboration with Emerging Professional Working Group. I am Richa Mishra, moderator for today's panel discussion. The theme for discussion today will be legislative and nature-culture links within the broader discourse of heritage in India. The experts on board various fronts of legislation aspect of cultural and natural heritage conservation and management in India, who will be discussing the good practices, gaps, opportunities in this area. I would now like to introduce our panelists. Dr. Shikha Jain, Founder Director Drona. Dr. Jain has an extensive portfolio on cultural heritage of India that covers conservation, world heritage, and museum planning of about 50+ projects, largely through her organization Drona. As an international expert on world heritage, she has advised the government organizations in Singapore, Malaysia, UAE, Myanmar, and UNESCO offices at Jakarta, Indonesia, Myanmar. She has also worked as a consultant to UNESCO New Delhi and represented Ministry of Culture India as an heritage expert on UNESCO World Heritage Committee. She is graduated from SPA Delhi, followed by Masters in Architecture from KSU USA and doctorate from De Montfort University, Leinster. She is the Vice President of ICOMOS and advisory member to MSc program UNESCO C2C. I welcome you here. The next panelist I would like to call upon Dr. Harsh Pathak. Dr. Pathak has a distinct professional specialization in constitutional and regulatory matters, international treatises related to conservation of built and natural resources, along with specialization in active areas of maritime laws, mining laws, etc. Dr. Pathak regularly writes and addresses in national, international journals and forums, medias on the foresaid areas of law. He is also associated with various educational organizations in India as well as abroad as a visiting faculty. He's the member of various forums concerning to public-private laws. He's the active member of FICCI, Tribuna Judicial European State, USIBC, India and US, to name a few. Actively engaged in various conservation projects of natural, built, tangible, intangible heritage, underwater heritage, Himalayan region related areas for conservation of glaciers. He is associated with the ICOMOS. I welcome you here, sir. Our next panelist is Dr. Gautam Talukdar. He is faculty in charge in Wildlife Institute of India, Category 2 on World Natural Heritage Management and Training for Asia and Pacific region. He has obtained his PhD from IIRS. He has a research experience of 2 decades in geoinformatics, landscape ecology, climate change, ecosystem services, and natural heritage. He is involved in several national and international projects like Asia Pacific Network, Urban Heritage Climate Observatory, amongst many others. He serves as an expert in the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas as well as lead author in IPCC 6th Assessment, WGII. Welcome you here, sir. Last but not the least, I would like to introduce Dr. Vishakha Kavatekar. Dr. Kavatekar is the head of the Center of Cultural Knowledge System and teaches in Masters of Architecture Conservation program at Department of Architecture in SPA Bhopal. She is the principal investigator for many collaborative institutional projects, which includes heritage impact assessment for Khajuraho World Heritage Sites, tentative listing documents proposed by World Heritage in national category of Chambal Rivers and Ravines, Ashapuri temples, She has more than 15 years of experience in collaborative research projects, including international projects. She has a book to her credit, namely Legal Framework for Protection of Built Heritage in India. I welcome you here, ma'am. So with this, I would like to invite the President ICOMOS, Naveen Piplani sir, to say a few words and mark the inauguration of the event. Over to you.
Hello and good evening, everyone. It is very heartening to see the panel today discussing, I think, one of the key aspects of heritage protection, conservation, and management, which is legislation. And however much conservation professionals want to, engage, it is this particular aspect which is kind of needs to be further explored and examined and revisited. So there are so many things that are beyond any heritage professional's reach or mandate. So this is going to be a very relevant session today with our distinguished panelists. I do want to bring to the fore the fact that this is a pre-event to a much larger event, which is our national annual scientific symposium hosted by ICOMOS India every year. And this year we are going to Lucknow for this event. It will be a hybrid event. You could join online or you could come and greet us in person. But it's going to be a very fascinating event that we are looking forward to, and many of the aspects that are there, but we haven't been able to really examine them because of one reason or another, will be discussed extensively. There are going to be over 40 scientific papers with at least 2 keynote addresses, and I'm sure some online and offline cultural events to experience the heritage and the heritage aspects more closely. There may also be some side events which I'm sure you would not want to miss. The umbrella theme is going to be cultural landscapes. I think there are some blurring boundaries in this domain, although there are a few definitions for all of us to kind of discuss, but we need to further explore and dig deeper to say that what does cultural landscapes mean from an indigenous Indian perspective, and how does this indigenous Indian perspective then feed into the larger global debate. So these are some of the broad ideas that we will be exploring rigorously over 2 days. So if you haven't registered, please do. I think people who are listening to or part of this event must immediately after the event not switch off the computer and straight away go and register. So that is one way you will just get your place in. With that, I would welcome our panelists, our participants, our moderators, the back-end team that has put this program together, our Central Zone Coordinator, Mr. Nishant, who is with us. And I know that it's not only Nishant, it's a whole lot of people, our institutional partner in AKTU and the Faculty of Architecture in Lucknow. So there's a whole lot of people working behind this event. So let's just join them and make the team bigger and bigger and make our voices stronger and stronger. With that, I hand it back to the moderator of this event. Congratulations and look forward to the deliberations today. Thank you.
Thank you for your good words, sir. So, dear experts, I would like to welcome you all on board here. Without taking much of your time and patience, I would like to put up my first question to Dr. Harsh Pathak. Sir, I would like to know that what is the legislative framework related to cultural, natural, or mixed heritage in India?
Very good evening to all of you, and thank you very much to Naveen for giving it a good prelude, and Richa for a wonderful introduction. You have really set the bar pretty high for us to cross with our credentials in the past. Let's keep it simple. That the legislative framework. I don't want to use very much of the legal lingua franca, but I would like to keep very simple so that we must understand from where the entire legislation came into place in terms of protection of heritage, whether it's a cultural heritage, tangible, intangible heritage. So the basic jurisprudence which we deal in Indian context is when, where, and how. Since when a particular built structure or a tradition is in place, where it is, and how it is going to be preserved or protected so that it can be continued and can be taken forward from the past, preserved and promoted in the present, and properly transferred to the future generation. So whenever we talk about the legislative intent, we always try to find out since when this practice or since when this building or structure is there. Secondly, where, because the local laws come into play. So the local laws, local traditions, local reservations, factors have to be brought in. And then we have got the regulations that how we can protect and promote it or preserve it further. So these are the three things whenever we talk about legislatively, we must understand when, where, and how is the basic framework. Now, let's move on to the second one. As far as the Naveen right says, the Indian subcontinent and culture and rich and boundaries and so many things. So we are one of the most heritage-wise, rich asset-owned subcontinent of a country. So our constitution very well recognizes it. So I find 3 articles very interesting, and I'm not going into, as I said earlier, for further details, but 29 says every individual has the right to protect the culture which they follow and which belongs to under fundamental rights. Then we have got Article 49, which is actually the part of the directive principles and which makes the state obligated to protect the monuments and take due care of it and regulate the area and the landscape. And then we have got the Article 51, which was added subsequently, and which makes every citizen responsible and duty bound as a fundamental duty to respect, protect, and follow the laws related to the conservation of monuments. So now when we see the Constitution is giving due weightage to it, we find legislations into it. Now, as I've already told you earlier, that where the monument is situated makes a lot of importance to it. So therefore, third stage comes the law. So we have got central laws where the monuments of national, international importance are notified by the Government of India under Monuments Act of 1958, and it has been preserved. The areas which are of regional importance and state-wise importance, they are governed under the state-owned acts, state acts for the conservation of the monuments. And then we have got various local authorities. So we have got the Central Act, which protects the national level importance monuments. We have got state, which protects through its own laws, the regional or state level important monuments. And then we have got regional bodies. Then we have got a further subdivision, the local bodies, municipalities, development authorities, district administration. Through their local laws, they protect the locality. To the micro level, they protect through there. Then we have got various policies by the Government of India, by the state governments. These are the one legislative framework. And before I conclude this answer to this question, there is another aspect which is not codified or as a law book, but the various judgments of the court and the various treaties to which the India is signatory, again brings the various framework for the conservation and protection of these laws. So if I look in totality, I find two of the laws very prevalent on which we fight before the court of law regularly, or see the cases regularly. One is the Monument Act of 1958, and secondly, the Environmental Protection Act, where the natural landscape and natural heritage is to be preserved. So in this way, we can say that the Constitution addressed to the issue, the central acts, state acts, local municipalities acts, the different judgments of the court, and our international treaties actually govern the legislative side of conservation and promotion of monuments in India. This is what is the legal framework.
So it was too much information in a nutshell. Very well said. And it's really important to know about the existing framework to actually define the future of our past. So thank you. I would like to put my next question to Dr. Talukdar. So how does the nature and culture goes hand in hand? Like, can you elaborate on the concept of the nature-culture linkages?
Thank you, Richa. I would like to take some simple examples for this nature-culture linkage. Let's maybe consider the example of a very important place, Kanchenjunga National Park, which is a World Heritage Site. It is also a mixed heritage site. It has got more both of nature as well as culture linkages built into it. So, you know, it satisfies most of the criteria that it needs to become a World Heritage Site. And within that landscape, a very important element is the Buddhist monasteries and the rituals that they perform. And you know, it's a very cold place, and how they live and the different cultures that are there associated, it forms a very important part. But rather than going into the complicated ways of understanding nature-culture linkage, I would like to simplify it further by giving an example. Say Kanchenjunga National Park is a very cold place and people like to keep themselves warm. So how do they do it? They definitely burn different kinds of fuel wood, etc., have room heaters. But traditionally what they did is they consumed alcohol. And the alcohol was brewed from the local species that grew there. One of the very important species that is there is the rhododendron. It's also called Buras in Uttarakhand, and it is called as Guras in the Kanchenjunga. And they brewed this liquor using various local other stuff like rice, millets, bajra, etc. And over a period of a week, you know, they brewed, and finally after about 2 or 3 weeks, they could distill the liquor out of it, and you know, the different process of distillation that they underwent, and they finally got a fantastic piece of liquor or wine, whatever they wanted to prepare. And this has become one of the very, very important liquor globally. So it's one of the top 50 liquors of the world. And more people actually end up preferring this particular liquor. So you see, the nature provides a very important resource, the rhododendron there. And over a period of time, people, you know, because they had to live in those harsh conditions, learn to prepare the liquor and subsequently learn to keep themselves warm. And then they finally could, you know, it's become a brand in itself. And this is a very typical nature-culture linkage that is there. Another important linkage I would like to highlight is from the Sundarbans, probably, wherein again it is a World Natural Heritage Site, but you know, this area abounds in fishes, and the different kinds of delicacies that the local people prepare from the fishes that abound there, and the recipes that have come. So, and the different kinds of processes where people consume these fishes, sometimes with rice, sometimes with sticky rice, sometimes dry, sometimes, you know, with a lot of gravy. Different kinds of preparations have also come up. So these are from the, you know, the cuisine part of it. But there are other kinds of, you know, areas where you can see a very important component of nature playing into the cultural heritage. For example, when we see the forts that have been built, they have taken advantage of the natural areas, the ridge lines, the vantage points, where you can see great distances. You see from the seasonality, how the sunlight would, you know, get into these areas, and accordingly build the cities and forts in these landscapes depending on the availability of water, the aridity. So we practically cannot separate out the natural part from the cultural part which has evolved. Any place which has got a lot of culture inbuilt would invariably have a lot of natural elements to deal with if you look with a magnifying glass there. So that's what I would want to say here and stop at this particular moment.
It's really interesting to know about it. Thank you, sir. I would now request Dr. Shikha to answer. Ma'am, what is unprotected heritage? Why it should be conserved? And how does government, through its policies and plans, respond to the unprotected heritage? There's been a recent document on the vision of Niti Aayog for safeguarding the unprotected heritage. So would like to hear your views on this.
Thank you for inviting me on this panel. And before I start responding, I would like to compliment ICOMOS Central Zone as well as the EPWG group who have put this together, along with all ICOMOS India members. I think both legislation and cultural landscapes are very important aspects, you know, which have not been addressed in totality. So I'm really happy to be part of this forum today. To answer your questions, you know, I think everyone knows what is unprotected heritage. It is basically heritage which, or, you know, built heritage or intangible or whichever, which is not under any legislation. So it means that you can make any changes. It can even be demolished like built heritage, and it is at a great, you know, risk. We are at a great risk of losing such heritage. So that is the purpose that, and I mean, as we know in India, we have a great repository of heritage, whether it's tangible or intangible, built or natural. And it is very important that we understand what is the kind of heritage, what is the quantum of heritage. I mean, when we were doing the Niti Aayog project, we realized that no one really has an idea of the numbers that we have. Or the nature of heritage that we are dealing with. So it is essential that we understand and we protect, and then of course we conserve it. I mean, we all know why conservation is essential to retain this heritage, our cultural identity for posterity, for generations to come, because this is what we learn from. And we can actually build our future, a sustainable future, if we understand this. So that's responding to your first two questions on what is unprotected heritage and why do we need to conserve it. On the Niti Aayog project, which is really quite an ambitious project, and we just in fact finished it last month and submitted the report to Niti Aayog. You know, we have had agencies in India, organizations like INTAC and NMMA, who have been looking at a national register or listing of heritage structures. Yet till now, we really don't understand the quantum of heritage, because both INTAC and NMMA have a very rigorous listing process, and it takes time, you know, like there may be listing that has been done in the 1990s, which needs to be updated now. So while we achieve certain number, like they have achieved 60,000 structures, but you know, it's only about 8,000 plus that can be validated today with images, and the other processes are going on. And NMMA is also in a similar situation. They have listed 11,000 structures, but most of them are without images, and they need to verify it physically on site. So these are important, actions or activities being undertaken by INTAC and NMMA. But at the same time, Niti Aayog realized that we need to have a quick, update on what is the quantum of heritage or nature of heritage that India has to even come up with some kind of policies. So I'll just give you a quick, 6-pointer that is what the Niti Aayog report is all about. It is asking what is the total number of built heritage structures, protected and unprotected in the country. And a total of 100,000 structures is listed there, with around 60,000 with images as evidence. And in this, protected is only about 10,000. Only 7% of the entire number is actually protected. So it's actually about 8,000, 7,000 plus that is under the state and ASI. Secondly, it says, what are the built heritage categories and typologies and their nationwide dispersal? And how can this data support conservation and reuse of our built heritage? And it also looks at who are the custodians of our built heritage, including public and private sector organizations, individuals, and NGOs. So it's looking at all the ministries, central level, as well as state government organizations who have some kind of built heritage under them, whether it's protected or unprotected. And to give you an example, if you look at the religious trusts, like Devsthan or Devsthan Department in Rajasthan or HRC in Tamil Nadu, which have something like 40,000 temple structures, and they are not actually protected. They are registered with Devsthan or HRC, but they are not protected under state archaeology. Then it looks at what are the various government schemes for funding and conservation of built heritage in India. And also, what are the various legislations at international, national, state, and local level for the built heritage? So whatever Mr. Harsh Pathak has just explained, basically it records all of it in the report as a ready reference. And what should be the long-term policy imperatives for India's built heritage at central, state, and local levels? So after understanding this quantum, there are some policy imperatives that have been suggested. And in that sense, it is a more detailed view of the larger quantum of unprotected built heritage of India, along with classifying it into categories, typologies, and ownerships for arriving at suitable policies. Because the numbers themselves have little meaning unless we understand the concentration and spread of the heritage across this country, its range of typologies, and its locational context and its level of protection. So I hope that answers what the Niti Aayog report is all about. And I think they will soon be keep putting it, on their website. So it will be open for everyone to look at. Thank you.
Thank you. It was so exhaustive. I think the quantification is the first step, and there's a long way to go ahead with the unprotected heritage. I would like to put my next question to Dr. Kavathekar. Ma'am, I would like to know that what are the provisions under AMASR Act and how are the recent amendments affecting the protected heritage?
Let's first try and understand what the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Site and Remains Act 1958 protects. It protects ancient monuments, it protects antiquities, it protects archaeological sites and remains. And then there is an associated area with all, with either the monuments or the archaeological sites that it protects, or it protects an area which is in and around the protected monument. So if we look at this act to protect the heritage, the way we understand it as built heritage or cultural landscape or nature culture link, then the act doesn't speak about it. So it has a very restrictive way of looking at what it protects. So it is actually applicable to ancient monument, antiquities, archaeological sites and remains, whose age is above 100 years, and it is recognized as protected area in the restricted archaeological sense. It declares the list of national monuments, and then it protects that list of monuments. So any monument before it comes under the protection has to be first declared. So this act gives you the declarative and acquisition powers. Then the act also recognizes ownership in three ways, which is private with regulatory control, government with regulatory control, or it is the acquired property under the regime of the act. The act also has an inbuilt provision for the list of protected monuments of national importance, as I had specified before. Then the act delegates the powers to preserve, repair, and maintenance of the monuments. It again acknowledges the living component of the protected monuments only in case of the religious structures. So protection of place of worship is again restrictive only for misuse, pollution, and discretion. And then it has miscellaneous powers, including penalties and other type of powers that it has. Now, the general expectation from the act is that it should protect all kinds of heritage, which is not the mandate of the act. So there was this whole debate on whether this act is effective or not, and how do you then actually evaluate the effectiveness of the law. A lot of discussions were centered around it, and we found that there is a preamble to the act and there are the provisions in the act. So if it satisfies that, then the problem is not with the law. The problem is with our expectation from the law. So this became very clear when we were doing a lot of research in and around the law of how and what gets protected inside this act. So when we talk about UNESCO conventions which are ratified by India, then the word heritage comes in a lot, but the law never speaks about the heritage because it is coming from 1904 Act. It had a list of national protected monument and it has continued. Recently, when we start speaking about the amendments, then one of the major amendments that have made impact is the amendment of 1992, which was about protecting 100 meters and 200 meters around the monument. But again, if you look at the amendment which was passed, then it was really for few monuments, which is now being used as a blanket on every site, and the context got missed. So one more attempt to bring in amendments, and then they also called that as validation, was the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Sites and Remains Amendment and Validation Act of 2010. In this, the major thing that you have to understand is that the definitions of what the act protects have not changed. So, but there are few differences which is from the parent act. So there is a minimum prohibited area and regulated areas. First, it was 100 meters and 200 meters, as I said, with the amendment. But now it is not only that, you can go up and down below the ground also. So that has changed in this act. Then it says no construction of any public project or of any other nature is permitted in prohibited area. That has changed. Then there is a new authority which was being set up, which is the National Monument Authority, so that it can look into the context, and heritage bylaws are being formulated for areas around the monument so that they are compatible, which is a very slow process, and we haven't achieved much in that area. Then it also spoke about construction, reconstruction, repair, and renovation, and everybody seemed to be happy. But then that also is coming with the permissions from the authority, and the basic point of providing relief to a lot of people who are living in and around monuments is a very, very slow process, and we haven't achieved much in that area too. So if we look into the larger area, we find that the basic definitions of what the act protects under the act remain the same. To the same protection, which is above ground and below ground for the same monument, is extended. That's it. And initially from no protection in the prohibited area, now we have started releasing to some public welfare, because it was that the agency who is implementing the act itself violates the act, because reuse is something which was not a part of the initial act, so that also needed to be facilitated. Providing visitor facilities was not a part and integral to the act, is now being added by saying new constructions. But the whole issue or the undermining fact remains that this act does not use word heritage. It does not is not made to protect cultural landscapes or larger landscapes or urban areas, and you really have to take help of a lot of other laws like Town and Planning Country Act, Forest Act, Water Protection Act. So a lot of allied acts are required when you talk about protecting larger nature culture links. And it is not only the central act, but also there are a lot of other very specific acts which were made, like for the Hampi Authority, or a very landmark act that I thought was the Majuli Cultural Landscape Region Act, which really needs to be evaluated much more carefully post implementation, because the intention of this act is very good. It not only talks about sustainable development, but for the first time in this act, traditional knowledge systems, the customary laws were all incorporated as a part of the mechanism to protect the law. So this law really needs to be evaluated very carefully for its effectiveness, for us to know where is the way forward. Thank you, Richa.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So also that India is a diverse nation. So there are varied political, geographical, and social conditions. And so it becomes difficult to deal all these diversity under the umbrella of one act. Dr. Hirsch, I would like to know from you that India is a diverse nation with varied geographical conditions throughout, like we have Himalayan region, the Narmada region, coastal region. So how does the geography play the role in the legislation?
This is a very relevant and a very important question to understand, which when we come to the macro level understanding of the conservation projects, whether it's a single monument or whether we are trying to protect an entire city or a landscape, we have got a diversity, and we have got right from the riverbeds to the coastal to the Himalayan regions, and we have got so many different varied geographical conditions. And every region has got its own uniqueness. Now, as Shikhaji and Vishakhaji has already dealt in detail about these, micro level interventions in this, I would like to get into the very micro level understanding of it, like the state through their own acts under the Land Revenue Code. We deal with the conservation of monument related acts, but we have to also consider the Land Revenue Code of a particular state when we are dealing with a particular monument in a particular region. Now, the local Land Revenue Code deals in a very systematic and a microscopic manner about the nature of the land and how it has to be maintained and how it has to be looked after by the local revenue authority. Because at the end of the day, the monument in a particular place or a culture at the particular place is the responsibility of the district administration. And this is the way we have got the administrative system and structure in our place. So when we talk about the different geographical locations, the local Land Revenue Code, and at the same time, the building bylaws, how that particular building, if we are specifically talking about a built heritage or a monument, that how the area around that is to be regulated, how it has to be looked after in terms of the title, how it has to be looked after in terms of the sustainable development in and around it. I find there are two kinds of legislation, which is one of the town and country planning. Secondly, what is the Land Revenue Code of that area that defines a lot of structure into it. At the same time, we have got various heritage bylaws, which are specific to the monuments as well. So these are the few areas at the microscopic level which gives us a very good understanding and a better understanding of a go ahead to do any of the conservation projects related to any of the monuments, whether they are on the riverbed, whether they are in the coastal region or in the Himalayan region. My personal experience, because I am associated with various mining projects, and at the same time with couple of the real estate projects and the development projects, infrastructure projects, public projects in Mount Himalayan states, that there have got a very specific building bylaws. So what is the restriction in the common coastal area or in a plain, that may not be applicable in the protection of the monuments, but they have got very different ways of protecting the monuments. So what I believe, the local laws, local revenue code, local building bylaws are the real essence to understand the conservation of a project, regulation of a protected monument, and how the sustainable development of in and around area can be done. Because merely protection is not possible, because now all the cities are expanding, the villages are expanding. So now these heritage properties are coming with the life. The people are start living around it. There are a lot of economic activities happening around it. So there needs to be a balance. And the local laws, specifically at the ground level, helps a lot of understanding and bring a proper balance between the economic activities, at the same time residential activity, along with the conservation of the heritage. So these are the few areas which I think we can address to the geographical aspects, and local laws of that particular area are the real indicator which gives us a real feel and guidelines for the particular region to have a better planning, to have a better sustainable conservation and heritage related concern of that place. Thanks. This is what is from my side for this.
Thank you, sir. The conversation is really getting more insightful. So now heading up with the second round of questions, I would request the experts to keep the responses under the given time framework, and in the second round, a little shorter. So Dr. Vaishakha, I would like to start from you. What is the status of heritage protection in India? Is the existing framework enough to sustain the present and future prospects? Where are we leading with the present status of protection with the heritage?
I think Dr. Shikha Jain was very rightly pointing out the nature and the quantum of heritage that needs to be protected. And can we have a mechanism which really can provide or extend the protection to all kinds of heritage? Now, that is the first point, I think, that needs a lot of deliberation, because protection has to happen at various phases and various stages. The way we have the national protection, the state protection, you have specially made laws, you have the 73rd and 74th Amendment of the Constitution that really has given powers for the local bodies to protect its own heritage, which is very important for that particular area. Given all that, what we also have to understand that protection of heritage need not and should not be aimed always to be a legal protection. If we can provide, well and good, but lot of our heritage has survived because we have really not depended only on law to protect our heritage, or the law to tell us what is the kind of nature culture link that needs to get protected, because the understanding of heritage has always gone on expanding over the period of time. So what we used to understand as heritage in 1972, now itself has gone through a lot of amendments. So it is dynamic, it is changing, and providing a law to changing things is not going to be easy. But as I have already spoken, that if there are specific aspects of it that needs to be protected, then there are certain laws under which you can provide protection. But still there is a lot of thinking that has to go into what we need to protect and how we need to protect. There are certain challenges that we need to understand that that actually are strengths to our understanding to protection. And one is about customary law and practices. We really have not gone into deeper details to understand those and see how they aid towards the protection of the of our heritage or of our nature culture link. Now, nature culture link cannot survive without the intangible that needs to be protected. So that is another aspect that we have to look into very wide details. Though the certain parts of it, like if you want to protect the dance, if you want to protect the music, it is fragmented protection that can be done through various laws. One more area which needs a lot of thinking is about authenticity and integrity, which we haven't been able to define it very clearly in our Indian context. Our society was full of sustainable practices. If you really look very carefully, we were really zero garbage societies. But we are now creating problems and then trying to bring in answers to our problems also. So through our traditional understanding of the knowledge that is prevailing in the society, so that can also be looked into. Then there are too many laws, but how do we dovetail them for the benefit of our heritage? Needs more studies, needs more understanding. Can there be some MOUs that can be built? There are few examples that we can study through how these MOUs can be built, but are they functional? What are the problems that actually come through while we are trying to dovetail a protection of a heritage through various laws? That needs a very, very careful investigation. Our documentation is always a question. Then there are multiple institutional frameworks. We do not involve local communities and stakeholders, and that remains too superficial in calling them as stakeholder meetings. Many a times it is done because it is required. And do we really look into two important areas, that is community empowerment and how to resolve the conflicts of interest which actually hurt our heritage? So both these aspects also need to be seen into greater depths. Thank you, Richa.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I would also like to know, I would request Dr. Talukdar to speak on this. I would also like to know what are the major challenges for protection of natural heritage in India?
So, thank you, Richa, again for the question. In fact, most of the previous speakers have touched upon it, though they have spoken for the cultural part. It applies for the natural part also. Dr. Harsh, Dr. Shikha, and as well as a previous speaker mentioned, we have to work across scales, whether it is national, state, or the local. And there is a lot of intangible heritage which needs protection. I would focus on two aspects primarily. One is from the management or the governance point of view. We do have very strong legislations in India for the protection of natural heritage. The problem stems on how it is implemented. And if it is enforced with a lot of force, you tend to alienate the local people or communities, and that is when the locals themselves don't value the heritage at all. So there is a question of how these laws and acts are implemented. The second part which I would like to highlight is, in spite of the strong legislations and the scales at which we operate, there are certain factors over which we have no control at all. For example, externalities like climate change, droughts or floods, or natural calamities, epidemics, loss of biodiversity, invasive species taking over. So these kind of challenges require specifically active management on ground, and we need to be always prepared on how do we manage or mitigate the problems or the challenges stemming from these external processes which continuously occur in a natural heritage. So these are the aspects I would like to highlight specifically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I would request Dr. Shikha to answer. Ma'am, will the emerging concepts like the historic city, the historic urban landscape, cultural landscape, the newer approaches be able to cater the existing lacunae between the protected and the unprotected heritage in India?
Thanks, Richa. That's an interesting question and I think very relevant. Definitely, I think we need to move out of this monument-centric approach, which has been practiced over years. And to some extent, even this listing of say 100,000 structures or X amount by other organizations, and even, the process that we went through in Niti Aayog is somehow still linked to that aspect, because we are treating, the building more as an artifact. Whereas it's, even in museums today, we say that the context needs to be there. So when we are dealing with a building in situ, then definitely the historic urban landscape under which it is set in, or the cultural landscapes in rural areas, it definitely needs to be addressed. And this is a very important point, which also, like in the policies recommended in the Niti Aayog report, it mentions specifically that recognition of these categories is very important. At central state level specifically, because now these categories some of them are recognized on our World Heritage list, like Kanchenjunga or Bhimbetka, they are on the tentative list, like the Apatani cultural landscape. And I would just like to say that we need to actually learn about this nature culture, or how we expand this into a legislation from the Northeast. Because it's in the Kanchenjunga case, which Dr. Gautam Talukdar was mentioning, that I learned that the legislation that actually came, into protection for the lakes as well as the peaks was not a top-down legislation, coming from the central or state government saying protect these peaks or, the lakes because of natural heritage only, because of natural value only. It was also because the locals associated with it. So when we presented it to ICOMOS, for the World Heritage nomination, it was shown how this local association translated into legislations, which is actually, which ensures its protection long term, because it's not a legislation that I am forced to accept, but it's something that I believe in, that has been translated into a protection status. And that really helps. And that's why you have these hydropower proposals, which are actually, which the local community there talks against, or they don't let it happen in certain cases. So we have a lot of learning from this, community and rural landscape, and specifically Northeast. And just one more point, like even while doing the Niti Aayog listing, we, communicated with around 500 organizations, state, center and local NGOs. And when the state of Meghalaya, like we wrote to them about built heritage listing, we got a letter from them which actually listed 130 plus sacred groves. And they said, we don't have any built heritage, but this is what we need to protect for our state. So please add it into the listing. And Niti Aayog was very open to that point, though the report is about built heritage and archaeological sites, but they recognized that cultural landscapes and these kind of elements like sacred groves need to be part of it. So I think, definitely we need to move towards a more macro approach, and cultural landscapes, historic urban landscape is the way to look at our heritage in future to come. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Indeed, it's the need of the hour to look for the new concepts to bring in varied typology of heritage under the umbrella of preservation. Dr. Harsh, with this, I think we are curious to know that fort areas or the macro areas where the activities are directly or indirectly affecting the heritage values. So with I would like to know that how are these situations tackled?
Yes, ma'am. Richa, I think with the time constraint I have in mind, I just would like to point out, the mining activity is one of the very essential activities, and it has got a very systematic now over the period of time because of the environmental clearance, where it is sine qua non. It is very important to start any of the mining activity and approval of a mining plan. So when we talk about environmental clearances and approval of the mining plan by the very competent expert technical agencies of the government, they look after this properly, that there should not be any adverse effect of the mining activity over the natural habitat, at the same time to the monuments which are nearby. So as far as the environmental clearance part is concerned, the air and water pollution and how the entire chemical or other nature which has been produced during the operation should not impact adversely about the natural heritage around the project area is looked after. Mining plan looked after that. There should not be the blasting operations which create sufficient instability in the land and put any of the adverse effect over the monuments. At the same time, there is a limit beyond which only the commercial activities can take place. So whenever there is any of the mining activity, and I'm saying this with my full responsibility because being the counsel for the Coal India and ONGCs and all these organizations which are working on land and on the seabeds as well, that the approval of the mining plan and the environmental clearances are very much in place, and they look after the entire total environmental impact on the nearby landscape. And only thereafter, once the approval is granted, the agencies are satisfied and the expert body is satisfied, then only these operations are taking place. So yes, as other panelists say, all laws cannot protect. It is the moral responsibility of the every citizen as well. That's why the Constitution says it is a fundamental duty of the every citizen to protect it. So yes, there is a system in place. There is a law in place. There is an agency in place. It's up to us, those who are involved in the business activities as well, that we should also appreciate the understanding to preserve the richness of heritage which we have, which gives a uniqueness to India and to us as an Indian. So yes, the mining activities with their legislation and competent authority has a system in place to preserve these areas in terms of environment, as well as from the mechanical impact of blasting and other heavy machinery utilization in terms of the mining. This is the way the present scenario is handled under the statute.
Thank you so much, sir. Though we have talked a lot in this direction, but I would like to know from you, Dr. Kavathekar, that what could be the major challenges for heritage protection in India?
I think the major challenge in the entire scenario that we should understand is that a lot of the laws are very restrictive in nature, and the time has come when it comes to protection of heritage, they now have to start becoming enabling laws rather than restrictive laws. So I think that is one major thing that we have to understand. Second is when we are trying to protect heritage, which is having a very strong nature culture link, we have to understand that there are many laws that exist, but every law has its own priority. So how do we bridge them together? A lot of work needs to be done on that if we do not want another new law to come in place. But if we do not succeed in bridging the gaps and trying to work hard very much to end the multiplicity of agencies that work on the same areas, then we won't be able to reach much grounds. Third is really to understand the fact that the law from which we are having our expectations have a mandate, and if our mandate doesn't suit that, then we have to think whether we really need to continue with the same law, or we really have to look into new laws with new definitions which can address the requirement of protection and the level of protection and the management of management of the heritage that we are looking forward to. So there is lots and lots of hard work that has to go into it, and I do understand that a lawyer's domain is very different from the other professionals' domain. But as long as the Constitution of India is giving us the rights and duties, it is still very feasible, and we should look into getting more and more legal protection to the heritage that is all around us. Thank you.
Seems that there are major gaps to be addressed. Would like to move forward to the last question of the panel discussion today. As we are already short of time, would like any one of the panelists to answer this question. What could be the possible way forward for protection of heritage in India?
Yes, one just 30 seconds point to add on this. We are losing a lot of heritage during the disasters, maybe because of the earthquake and flood and the cyclone. So I think that the disaster management and these new policies will take care of this to protect these monuments and these. There is a lacuna in the legislative system, and we need to bridge that. I leave it to the others to add on.
I'll quickly add on. Basically, the new directions in the natural heritage conservation acknowledge conflicting relationships between societies as well as their environments, and they seek to respond to impending global crisis due to overconsumption of resources, climate change, and biodiversity extinction. We need methodological changes which include advancing more holistic natural cultural approaches, recognizing the role of governance in successful management strategies, integrating scientific and traditional knowledge and valuation processes through engagement with indigenous people and local communities, and promoting right-based approaches. In fact, these shifts should influence our body of knowledge and help us to institute value-based policies that constitute a radically new context for conceiving, evaluating, and prioritizing natural heritage conservation. Thank you.
Do we have something from the other panelists?
I think already stated, about having more of a bottoms up rather than a top down approach. So I just reiterate what Mr. Talukdar has said. It can also be done for not only natural, but also for cultural. Okay.
Ma'am, it's muted.
I just want to repeat what I had already said, was that we really need to see how we can enable rather than restrict when it comes to protection of heritage.
Thank you. Thank you all. It's been indeed a pleasure for having such conversation with the experts of the field. I'm sure the audience is equally excited to be part of the same. I greatly appreciate your time and efforts for being in the panel. Meanwhile, I would request the audience to put on their questions in the chat box. Now, meanwhile, I would request Ms. Nitya Lakshmi Iyer, EPWG member, to add concluding remarks to today's session. Over to you, Nitya.
Thank you, Richa, and thank you so much, all of you, to all the panelists and experts here. It's been a wonderful and very enriching experience listening to all of you, engage in a conversation related to legislation, nature, culture, linkages, and, cultural landscape. I think I'd like to just sum up a lot of what you all have said, and what I have gained off of this is that a lot of the legislation that we have already in place simply can be identified or looked at through three lenses: the what, where, and how, as it was rightly pointed in the beginning. And we need to also sort of really look into and dig deep into how we bring people together, how we work in a more integrated way, as opposed to everyone doing different aspects of work in their own respective fields. So encouraging a lot more collaboration, not just with different organizations that are working in the field of culture, but also within the way we put together different guidelines and regulations. It will be good to form bridges within those aspects as well. And finally, also, we need to have a certain set understanding of what we have in our country in order to be able to identify how we can go further and go ahead and really safeguard what we have. So understanding what is the stock that we have, ensuring that we are able to work together with different agencies in order to not just document these, but also regulate, manage, and maintain these resources. Cultural resources is very important. And then also stepping back from the whole discourse of not just looking at heritage from the tangible and intangible lens, but also understanding how the nature as well as the culture of that area really integrate into it. Because at the end of the day, context is key, and it is very important for us to understand that, and understanding the scale at which the project needs to be undertaken also helps us understand the context and vice versa. So those were some of my key learnings from the whole discussion that happened. And thank you so much to all the speakers and participants in order for us to take that forward. I'd now like to hand over the mic to Nishant, who can then give us the vote of thanks.
Hello. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, Nishant, we can. Please go ahead.
That's great. So thanks a lot. I could attend the discussion from Brussels, and it's a bit, the internet is not so good, so I had to come out. So there might be a little noise here. So so thanks a lot, first of all, Ecommerce India for letting us have this platform, and the XCOM. The panelists, the 4 panelists, it's really kind of you that you could make time and give us your very useful inputs. And the discussion definitely went the way just how we anticipated. It's a little pity that we could not take up more questions and more discussions from the audience as well. But I have seen it in my experience that these panel discussions always take a little bit like that. So thanks again, and thank you, Dr. Jain, Dr. Talukadar, Dr. Pathak, Dr. Kavitkar, and ultimately I would also like to thank the people who made this possible for us, which is Nitya, who kindly agreed to be the reporter, and Lipika, who kindly agreed to handle all the Zoom and the background, a lot of background work. And of course, I cannot miss here Richa Mishra, who really made this possible, because she went through talking to all the panelists and organized a good set of questionnaire and to put forward to all the audience. And I also take this opportunity to invite everyone to attend the symposium, which is due on 19th and 20th of November, which is on cultural landscape. And that is why we designed this event to be a kind of a prequel event, which sets the theme for the upcoming symposium. And the registration can be done from the website. It will be very good to have all of you there. And ultimately, I would like to thank our president, Dr. Pipalani, as well, to kindly agreeing to give a welcome note as well. And thank you. Have a good day. Over to you, Richa.
Thank you so much, Nishant, for your kind words. Due to time constraints, apologies for not being able to take the questions from the audience. Thank you all for being part of the session today. Hope you have a great day.